Hi, it's Dave. This is part two of a conversation I'm having with James Douma. In our part one, which I'll link in the video description, we had a fascinating conversation, a deep dive into ARK Invest's $3,000 Tesla price target, their Monte Carlo model. James finally unpacks for the Tesla community why the Monte Carlo model is important, but not just that, what the input items are and how it works. And so that was fantastic. I totally appreciate that conversation. This part two, we're going to take another step forward and we're going to try to build, and James is going to help us build some models from scratch and kind of use the power of modeling to help us kind of examine assumptions, but also see where those models lead to. So James, I know we've been wanting to do this for a while. You brought this up a few weeks ago, so we finally get the chance. So what do you have for us in terms of modeling?
Yeah, so I thought we'd go through building a couple of simple models. And I mentioned in the previous one that I think a good way to use models if you're an individual investor, especially in growth companies, is to try to help you figure out what matters and then drill down on the thing that matters and figure out how to take what you know is true, like facts you can look up on Google, numbers that you can get out of the company's financials and whatnot, and sort of and try to understand, well, what does that mean in terms of like my ultimate goals with respect to making this investment or not making this investment. So one question, like not all of these models are financial models. And one of the an important question that faces Tesla, which is something that can be addressed with a model, I think, and isn't too complicated. We'll go through making that model today. And this is a question of like, so say that they get FSD working, right? Like they've got an FSD, it's pretty polished, people are pretty happy with it. And now they have to get to a point where they convince regulators. So how long does that take? Well, we know that, both from what Elon has said and from, just essentially what we understand about the regulatory process, Tesla's going to go out there, they're going to run autopilot in the driver assistance mode, and they're going to look to see like what happens during those long stretches of time where the driver's watching the car, but the car is pretty much running the show. Once you have enough experience with that, you can go to regulators. And when I say experience, if you've got enough miles under the hood of the car, not requiring any interventions and achieving a certain set of results, and these would be mainly safety results with respect to regulators, you can say to the regulator, so here's statistical evidence that shows with 95% confidence that we get 2 times fewer accidents than people. Like that's the nature of the data you want to be able to take to a regulator to get approval. And so the question is, how many miles is that? And how long would it take Tesla to get to that point? So that's a model that we're going to build right now. So okay, so of course, what goes into miles is like, how many cars do you have driving? How many miles do they drive? How many of those are on FSD? So these are things that are kind of obvious. So let's start with what's a Tesla fleet size? And just we'll do this in millions of vehicles, so the numbers don't have tons of commas in them. And let's see. Actually, we're going to do this. We call this a ratio and a number. Okay, so we start with 1 million cars, right? Tesla's at about 1 million AP capable cars right now. So we're doing round numbers here because what we're trying to understand is not, is it going to be 49 days or 50 days? What we're trying to understand, is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? How long does it take to do this kind of stuff? Because obviously the consequences, if it takes 5 years to gather the data, well, that says something important about FSD. So is it going to take 5 years? Is it going to take a year? How long is it going to take? So, okay, now let's say we're going to guess that only US cars, or that, Tesla, they're just going to bite off the US to start with. So we'll look like fraction of cars in fraction of fleet in US. Okay, so let's say that's 50%, right? So what we're going to do is we're just going to dial ourselves down. Now, the reason I'm doing this as a spreadsheet this way is so that when we get done, we can go back and we can adjust these numbers and we can see how they impact the end of it. Okay, so another limiter on this will be the FSD take rate. So how much of the of the U.S. fleet actually has FSD. So let's get, 2 is a number, 0.2 is a number that we've heard, right? So we can, and how many, let's say, how many of the people, who get, maybe not everybody who has FSD beta in their car is willing to use it. Like maybe some people are kind of uncomfortable with this, or maybe they're not. But we'll just assume people use it as our initial input. Okay, so how many miles is a car? Miles per car per year, right? So if you research this on the internet, you will find estimates of between around 11,000 and 15,000. So people like the AAA estimate around 11,005, like I went ahead and researched these numbers so we don't have to do it in real time. Let's just say 10,000 miles. We'll guess a little on the low end. We'll do this in K miles per year. Okay, so total FSD miles per year. I want to say billion, because billion might be the scale that we need to get to. Okay, so we have 0.1 million times 10,000. So we just multiply these together. If I get that right. Okay, so with these inputs here, so this is an input. I'll underline the inputs just so we know which things are calculated. Right. Okay, so we can change any of these numbers. So now we got a simple model where we've got like these 4 or 5 questions. Like we put numbers into these and we can see how things. So so how many cars drive with FSD beta? Obviously we got 1 billion miles per year in this scenario. And if this changes, if only 50% of people are willing to drive with it, your miles per year goes to 500 million. So that's just an example of how this model works. I'm sorry if this seems really simple. It'll get more complicated.
No, this is good. Yeah.
Okay. How many, so that the other part of this question is how many miles needed to validate? Okay. So we'll take this as a topic. And let's say, okay, so the fundamental method for doing this stuff is you drive the car and you see what the accident rate is. And then you compare it to the accident rate of cars that don't have FSD. Now, so that could be other Teslas driving with AP, driving not with AP. It could be the fleet. So what regulators would want to consider might vary. Well, let's be a little conservative on this assumption. So now conservative in this case would mean what's the safest group of human drivers we could compare it to, but where the human's driving the car, right? So I would say like a good candidate for that would be, Tesla publishes these numbers on the incident rates that they have with cars that have AP driven with and without AP, and cars that don't have AP. All right, they've got those 3 categories. So let's say cars that are, they have AP, but they're not using AP. What's the accident rate? So that's a situation where it's a modern car. It's got all the great safety equipment and everything in it, but a human being is driving it. So maybe that would be the most conservative, because we'd be comparing the FSD cars to the most, to a population of cars we get good data on, because Tesla's going to have good data on those cars too. So we have a rough idea what those incident rates are. So how often do they incident rate? How often do they crash? And let's see, accident. So I took these off of the website. Drivers. So this is miles, millions of miles. So normally, if you're building this model yourself, of course, you'd go figure this stuff out and you go look up these numbers. But I went just in the interest of saving time, I looked these up ahead of time, and you can get these off of Tesla's website. I'm rounding these off. Okay, so we could speculate about what regulators will care about. Now, you get more data quicker if you look at more frequent incidents. If you look at less frequent incidents, it turns out that the less frequent incidents tend to be the highest consequence, highest severity incidents. So for instance, the lowest frequency incidents that we have good statistics on are fatal accidents. Now, we have really good statistics on fatal accidents because it turns out pretty much all of them get reported. And the NHTSA gathers detailed data about all of those. So we got a pretty good database of those numbers. So that's a benchmark that they could use, and we'll look at that one in a minute. But right now, we're just gonna look at incidents or accidents. According to, let's assume that Tesla's using the same metric for an accident that they use in the other data that they propose. So let's ask the question, like, if this was the comparison basis, like, how long would it take to do that, right? Okay, so how many? And you could have spacing if 10x human. So one thing we could ask is, say the goal is, that we think that regulators are going to want it to be twice as good as a human, right? So that would be, and we're going to pick this category. Okay, so that means we need 7 million miles or 35 million miles. So this is how far apart we would need to determine that incidents were happening on FSD in order to be able to make a statement about that. Now, of course, if FSD drives 7 million miles and we don't have an accident, it could be a coincidence, right? Because normally you only expect an incident every 3.5 million miles. So you got to drive more than 7 miles. I went and I looked up what I looked at the math for this, and so depending on how much confidence you want to be able to have in making a statement, you need more miles, right? Because the spacing is going to vary kind of randomly, and if you only have 3 or 4 examples, there's a small possibility that it was just a fluke that you only got that many examples in a thing. As a general rule of thumb is, if you have enough statistics to gather 100 incidents, you've got really, really, really good statistics. Like, within a very, very fine degree how frequent something is. Another rule of thumb is, you can say with a pretty high degree of confidence, not 99.99% confidence, but you can get way over 95% confidence if you've got enough miles to have 10 events occur. Okay, so how many miles do we need for 10 events? Okay, so if, let's see. AP drivers. Yeah, so we'll just copy these here. We'll go ahead and put all 3 of these categories in here, since this is a pretty easy multiple to do. And we just take 10 times this, right? Okay, so this is how many miles that we would need for those. And if we wanted to be twice as good, right? Because 70 million miles, right? Kind of the rough ballpark of where we're at. We'll be able to go back in.
So quick question on you said required spacing 2x human, you did 7 million miles. You just doubled the accident spacing for AP drivers. Why did you do the AP drivers versus the non-AP drivers versus just US vehicles? Why did you
I
choose
just pulled
AP?
these. I just pulled these data off of the website so
Hmm.
that we have them handy, because maybe we want to look at the other scenarios also. It
Okay.
was just together. I put them on there.
Okay.
You can consider them just for reference right now. But so, we know this is what vehicle, it's like 470,000 miles
Hmm.
between accidents is the average on US highways. And this is the number that Tesla calls out. So I just rounded it off to 500,000. This is the spacing between accidents in terms of million miles for non-AP drivers. Oh yeah, actually we want to use non-AP drivers, don't we? I'm looking at the wrong one. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah, I would
discovered
imagine.
my first flaw.
Yeah, I would imagine that. Yeah, yeah. I just thought maybe you're being extra conservative, using
No,
AP
I'm
drivers.
looking at the wrong thing is what I'm doing.
Okay.
Okay, so we want this guy 40 million miles.
Yeah.
That would be so
And then
if
and then your required spacing 2x human, that would probably be 4, right? And then 10x human would be 20,
yeah,
right? And line 18 and 19.
2x human perform 2x human, let's see, 2 times better than human, uh, and this is 10 events. So if uh, if we're 2 times better than human beings and we have 40 million miles in the can, like we have 40 million miles that FSD has driven, we will know if we are 2x better or not with with 95% confidence because we've got 10 events, right? Of course, if we get to 40 million miles and you've got, 3 events, well, you're just you're more than 2 times better than human. But if we assume you're only 2 times better than human, and that's our threshold, right? Then we should know that for sure by the time we get to 40 million miles, one way or the other. We're either going to know that we're not, or we're
Sure.
going to know with a high confidence that we are. So that's why, we kind of walked through this process and we're extrapolating from this number, like the accident spacing for non-AP drivers. So these are people who have AP in their car. Well, in other words, they have a recent Tesla. And the point of having AP in your car is you've got AEB, you have all of the passive accident avoidance stuff that's not FSD. And so we're going to be comparing FSD to the most comparable set of data that we have access to, which isn't FSD data, right? Where a human being is driving the car. So that's the thesis here.
Quick correction. So line 18B
Mm-hmm.
should be 4 and 19B should be 20.
Right. Years required for 10 events is going to be, let's see. Let's see, 40 million miles. Yeah, okay. This. Okay, now we got a model. Maybe we want weeks since it's not very many years. Okay, so it takes 2 weeks of gathering data, given all this stuff that we have right here. So we could go back and we could say, well, maybe we want to be more conservative on these things. Maybe we think there's only 0.8 million cars in the fleet that have AP2 right now. I think it's higher than that, but so these would be, and then maybe we think that only, so 20%, 50% in the US. Let's say only 50% of people are comfortable driving with FSD, right? So I just did that thing where I went through and I made all the numbers more conservative. So now I have a really conservative model. But still, what we got is it takes 5 weeks right now with the fleet. Now that's if FSD is available today. Of course, if they don't, if it takes the rest of this year for them to get FSD polished up to the point where they want to start taking data, to try to convince regulators, then this number would be quite a bit higher. You'd have another 700,000 cars. So it'd be like maybe 1.5 million cars, right? And then it would only be taking you 2 weeks to get there. Okay, so we can, there's one other thing. There's a more conservative case that's worth considering. And that is, what if the comparison is fatal accidents in non-Tesla cars? I mean, fatal accidents in Tesla cars, I guess we don't know what the fatal accident rate in Tesla cars is. We could speculate that it's, we could take this same multiple. So fatal accident, so the reason that regulators might be interested in that. So right now I've got a number here, which is like 2 weeks. And what that basically says is that in the window, if regulators are willing to look at like regular accident incidents and take their statistics there, which is not an unreasonable proposition, that Tesla can push FSD out to the fleet and they can gather statistically significant amounts of miles in 2 or 3 weeks, right? In other words, I think on an earlier call when we were chatting about this, I was saying, yeah, maybe it'll take 6 months, maybe it'll take a year, because a couple of years back, I did this calculation when the fleet was a lot smaller and I got much bigger numbers, right? So now I'm redoing the calculation. I'm like, wow, it's really not going to take a lot of time. Well, what if regulators were really conservative and they wanted you to get enough miles that they saw what the fatality incident rate is? Because that would be based on the speculation that maybe FSD is really good at everyday accidents, but maybe it has some kind of fatal flaw that causes fatal accidents, like really severe accidents that happen at a higher frequency, which is somehow not elucidated by the other accidents. That is super unlikely, right? But you could imagine a regulator maybe out of an abundance of caution wanting to do that. So fatal accidents in urban areas, I looked this number up earlier, it's 0.86 incidents per 100 million miles. So fatal incident spacing. So in what? Millions of miles? So it's 100 million divided by 0.86. So it's 116 million miles per incident. It's a lot of miles. So how long would it take to gather statistically significant data? Well, so Tesla's under this scenario, they're, where half of the people are actually driving with it, but they start collecting data next year. They get 0.75. They're getting 750 million miles a year. So in the space of a year, they would have enough statistics that they should have had like 6 accidents, it looks like. So yeah, like a year. So we just built a simple model where this is a super napkin math model. Obviously, we're not doing very complicated things on it. But what we've done is we've gone through the process of asking ourselves, so what matters for the thing that I try to understand? Like what things that I know or that I can find out from a reputable source that I can plug into this number? And can I work my way forward to a reasonable conclusion about how long it would take to do that? Because this is a pretty important metric. If it takes 5 years to gather enough data to satisfy a regulator, then it makes the scenario where Tesla has FSD but can't use it plausible, right? If it takes 5 years to convince a regulator, then a large chunk of your market opportunity might wander away while you're waiting for the regulators to move. But what we get here is that our worst case scenario, and this is assuming that they start at the end of this year. So if they started gathering data at the end of 2021, like if they had FSD working well enough that they were happy with it, at the end of 2021, they decided to start gathering data, and assuming the system was actually good enough, they would have good enough data to convince the most skeptical, reasonable regulator that we could come up with inside a year. So that sets what I would call an extreme upper bound on how long it should take to gather data. So they would probably know within a month how well they were doing. And Tesla probably knows on a month by month basis. I mean, we can sort of look at this and we can say, well, look, if they can, if they're twice as good as human and they need good statistics of 10 events, if they have FSD on the fleet, they get that data in 2 weeks. So, if these numbers here are reasonable, and they seem reasonable, they're not way off, then once Tesla pushes FSD out to the people who bought it, and assuming half the people actually use it, they're going to be every 2 weeks, they're going to be able to basically every time they roll an update 2 weeks later, they've got good statistics on accident rates. That's what this model is telling us.
I'm wondering, several years ago, I think it's in the Master Plan Part 2, Elon Musk said he expects 6 billion miles before worldwide regulatory approval. Where do you think those numbers come from?
Did he say 6 billion?
I think he said something in that.
Yeah, so what 6 billion would be 60. Well, so like I said, there's this rule of thumb that 100 events, on a binomial distribution, which is like an event that occurs or doesn't occur and that happens infrequently, that you need 100 positive events.
Got it.
To have super rock solid statistics on frequency, right? So like if he was somehow starting from, there's this thing that happens every 60 million miles and we need 100 events, that would get you to 6 billion miles.
Maybe maybe there's a worldwide fatality rate of 1 person per 60 million miles. And so he's thinking, 6 billion miles would
100x
do 100x that. Maybe that's the thinking
behind
this thing. Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is actually pretty cool stuff because it shows that at least for, the accident spacing, like that's going to happen very quickly because just in a matter of a few weeks, you could get, 10 events. In a matter of a few months,
it's like
you get
1 million cars is a lot of cars.
In a matter of a few months, you can get, like 100 events. And after 100 events, it's like, okay, that's basically most of it. So
we know what it is.
Yeah. So, and the question is, well, regulators could, ask for fatalities and they can go from 10 to 100 events. So there could be some, I guess, variance of time.
You would, if you wanted to posit that there was something qualitatively different about extreme accidents than there were extreme and rare accidents than there were about common everyday accidents, I think that's a stretch. And I think it's unlikely that would be the stance that most regulators would take. But they don't get any credit for being fast, I guess, in their job description. Although, the flip side is that once you have a lot of statistics that show that these things really work, regulators will start to feel pressure to deploy them, right? Because, so in the US, like tens of thousands of people die every year. And for every person who dies, 50 people go to the hospital, right? And there's, I forget, it's 1.2, $1.5 trillion of property damage. Just eliminating property damage and medical damages from car accidents, like that alone would be like a Tesla-sized business opportunity, just reducing and so I think that when the data is out there that makes it common sense, like if it really is 2 times as good as people, you're going to know. And it's possible that, the system keeps getting better. By the time they have data proving that it's 2 times as good as people, they'll have anecdotal data that the latest version is 10 times as good as people, right? Well, and that might not be I understand like 85% of accidents are just drivers not paying attention. And that's not a problem autopilot has. Right?
Yeah. So I had this thought this past week. I was thinking, with full self-driving, it's kind of this interesting phenomenon where there's this point of where it gets, let's say, twice as safe as a human, hypothetically. There's this point all the way up to this point. Full self-driving kind of just sucks. It's just like terrible, and meaning it's just in this category of kind of almost unusable / dangerous, etc. But the moment it crosses over this threshold where it's 2 times as safe, it's going to be increasing that safety or that reliability very quickly after that point. And so it reaches this point where it's like, oh, this is pretty good. And it changes the whole attitude of, full self-driving was like not that great. And it changes to where it's like, oh, this is pretty good. But before you even know it, the rate of progress is continuing to increase, and you start to pick it up as a driver, and it just gets better and better and better. Whereas below that threshold, the improvements, like, they're nominal, like they don't make that as big of a difference, I guess, in terms of feeling confident, because the whole experience is kind of like subpar. So, but I guess the theory or the conclusion that I posit is, after full self-driving reaches that critical threshold, and Tesla will know, very quickly with their data, it will get increasingly better. Like, it's the worst version of full self-driving we have right now is right now. It's like, it's always going to get better, but at a certain point, people are going to like notice and appreciate that difference a lot more, and that's going to, I guess, lead to a lot more adoption of full self-driving, but also a relatively perhaps quick rollout in terms of, I don't know what the exact robotaxi situation will look like, but it just seems like, people are discounting full self-driving a lot because it hasn't reached this threshold. But once it reaches it, then it's got a lot of momentum to just continue to improve and to roll out faster than what people think. Do you have any thoughts kind of on that idea?
It's human adoption of technologies is a really interesting beast. A friend of mine posted on Twitter that he lost a bet, a 10-year bet with a friend, because 10 years ago he had bet a friend of his that voice recognition interfaces were going to be great. They were going to be magical in 10 years, right? And he felt like he lost that bet, and so he's taking his friend to dinner, right? That was the thing that they bet. And I was thinking, the thing is, like, I worked in voice recognition interfaces. I developed voice recognition user interfaces for use inside a car like 20 years ago. And I will tell you, voice recognition today is magic. It is so good. But the thing is, it got better step by step, right? Like, he was lamenting that it didn't, he was expecting it to just be perfect and great or whatever the deal is. It's really, really good. But it's that frog in, boiling in water or whatever kind of thing. Like, things that change incrementally, you're just used to them and they seem mundane. So, things can increase 10% a year. If they increase 10% a year, they're, after 10 years, they're dramatically better. It's way more than twice as good, right? It's, 2.5 times better than it was before. And you won't notice, like, a 10% increase a year is completely below the radar for people. I think AP increases a lot faster than the threshold where people aren't surprised. And we do tend to get these steps, right? I've been driving AP like since day one. And, the experience is they roll out a new functionality. People are upset because, like, all of a sudden, they got this great new function and they're pretty excited about it. But now they're noticing all these bugs, these errors, right? And so there's like all this, grumbling, and, people are upset and whatnot. And then over the next like 3, 4, 5 weeks or whatnot, it gets dramatically better week by week by week, because they're just chasing down the bugs and they're getting the really big bugs out. And then at the end of that 3-week process, it's a lot better than it was before they made the change. But people kind of, at that point, they feel like it's just back to normal. It's like there's a thing about people's perspective on change is super localized. It's very sensitive to what they saw yesterday and the day before, and it's much less sensitive to what they were experiencing a month ago. And they don't even remember what it was like a year ago. So you do get these kind of strange things where people's perception of how the system is performing can be really out of whack to how it actually is performing. And a lot of that just has to do with sort of the sequence of events that evolve the rollout when you get step changes, right? And step changes are great. I kept records for a really long time. Like, I had a couple of benchmark routes where I would reliably get, interventions at a certain rate, frequency or whatnot. And I could look in my notebook over the span of years. I could just see the interventions go, they'd go zoom, zoom, zoom. It was just like this zigzag line. The trend was super clear. But when you were on, if it had recently spiked up, like a week ago, you'd be feeling like, oh God, it's never going to get better. It's terrible. When is this going to end? And it's so much better than it was 2 months ago, but you've forgotten that at this point. Right. So it's hard to speculate about that kind of stuff. Like, because I know, my own experience as an engineer developing tech and pushing it out to people is that people can have these, they can very strongly feel something is true that isn't supported by the data at all with respect to, and this is AI things are kind of like that. Like, when you use a voice recognition interface, like how often does it piss you off, right? Well, what happens is people change the way that they use them over time. The better it gets, the more you push the system. And you push the system until you get a certain failure rate. And then you just use it less, or you're less careful about how you lose it, or whatever the deal is. And so your perception is kind of like, well, it sucked before and it still sucks. And you don't notice that you're able to just gradually relax the way that you're using it. And it's actually getting a lot better. But in a weird way, like you don't really know. So like somebody from 10 years ago, like you can talk to your phone, you can ask it what the weather is, or it's like I dictate all my text messages, right? I sometimes like do long, I'll dictate long form emails. It's kind of burdensome right now to dictate a long form email. You have to do it enough that you get used to the interface. Most people, they're used to talking to other people. Like that's their benchmark. So until the system's better, I do think there are these thresholds, but even when it's better than people, you'll say, well, it's better than my kid, or it's better than my idiot neighbor, but it's not better than my professor, because that's also a spectrum, right? Yeah. So it's tough to say if there's a threshold where people will suddenly get. I hope there is.
Yeah.
I would like people to appreciate the magic of these systems that are being given to us now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people really enjoy autopilot. You see there are a ton of fans out there like, man, like I can't even think of driving a car right now. Like if I couldn't buy another car with autopilot, I would never sell my car. This would be the last car. I would have this car forever, because it's more important to me than any other feature of the car by some huge margin at this point. Not everybody feels that way. And I wish they did, because it's really awesome.
All right. So what we did was in part one, we did a deep dive into ARK Invest. In this part two, we dived into Tesla FSD validation model. What would it take? How many miles? How long it would take to see Tesla's FSD be better than, let's say, a non-FSD car? And how long would it take regulators to approve of that? For part, we wanted to do a valuation model of what FSD could add in terms of valuation to Tesla's model. And I want to actually push that out to part 3, because I want to give ample time to really dive into a lot of questions with that. So we're going to have to wait for another recording, hopefully tomorrow, our time. But anyways, did you have anything on kind of the first 2 topics, ARK, but also this kind of validation model, James, that you wanted to share before we kind of wrap up?
Well, the validation model was going to be an easy model to just sort of get the idea of like, you can build easy models. They can answer useful questions. They don't have to have a lot of parameters. There's a large space of things that are useful to know that you can figure out from things that you can just look up on the internet. And so that was going to be a demo of this. The valuation model is probably going to be the meat of the modeling thing, but we'll get to that tomorrow.
Yeah. I think a lot of people will be interested in seeing that. Awesome, James. Thank you for your time again, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay.
Take care.